all you amazing dog moms and dads out there. My name is Kelly Weld, and I am the proud parent of two rescue dogs, Blue and Olive. Just like you, I want my dogs to live long, happy, and healthy lives, and my guest today is going to tell you how. I have with me the pet nutrition expert and author, Nora Lenz. Nora has been teaching and studying dog and cat health and nutrition for over 20 years. She's been inspiring pet parents to declare their independence from the sick pet industry through her website, nomorevetbills.com. Nora's book, Dog Nutrition 101, and online essays are research-based, supported by peer-reviewed articles, and challenge the very fundamentals of animal nutrition and healthcare. Nora has helped me and thousands of others prevent and even reverse chronic disease in our pets using what she calls rotational monofeeding, a method of home feeding and caring for our pets that is simple and effective. I'm so happy to welcome Nora back and excited to be doing a follow-up interview. Thank you for being here, Nora.
Thanks for inviting me, Kelly. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. So since releasing our first interview I did with you, I think it was maybe last month, we've had several requests to do more. And today I thought we could discuss rotational monofeeding in a more methodical and comprehensive way for those who are new to this way of feeding. So first, let's talk about pet food in general. Nora, what led you to conclude that commercial pet food is bad, and what started you in the home feeding for dogs?
Well, initially, I bought the idea that the more money you spend on the food that you feed your dog, the better the food is, the healthier your dog will be. And I was recommending to everybody that they feed. There was a brand, I don't know if I should mention it, but there was a brand, and really a standout brand in the 90s. And there were just a few, but this one was near the top, and I was recommending it, and their dogs were still chronically diseased. One even died of cancer. It was absolutely heartbreaking that these people had taken my advice and their dogs were still dying. So I knew that there had to be a better way. But even before I discovered these, a better class of dog food, I was just kind of fumbling around. I would take, regular commercial dog food and mix in supplements and various things that I thought were healthy for humans at the time. I now know differently, but I did what everybody does. They just kind of put stuff in there that they think might help the dog and hope for the best. But once I made that discovery that all commercial dog food, it wasn't really a discovery, it was more of a realization. All commercial dog food is made with, one primary goal, and that is to make money for the people who are producing it. And that presents a conflict, because my number one goal when I feed my animals is that they be well for life, that they stay well for life. And I think this idea that we've accepted that it's okay for dogs to be chronically sick and to accept these symptoms like we accept them in ourselves, that they're normal is, it's crazy. It's a commercial for the sickness industry.
Right.
Basically, it keeps us in that thinking that we can't do anything about it, and just, handing over a credit card when the dog gets sick.
Right.
So that was, and I began also discovering the deceptive practices that commercial dog food producers use to conceal the fact that they're using mostly really cheap products that would otherwise be considered waste. And they are waste. They're waste from the human food processing system. And the dog food industry and pet food industry in general has invented these terms that are very vague and obscure, and they put them on the label and people don't really know what they are. And they've done this very subtly and psychologically, like using the word byproducts. Nope, they will say no byproducts, but what does that mean? A byproduct is actually an organ. Any product that we don't eat. It could be liver, which is good for dogs, or it could be beaks. And there are a beak is a tiny little part of a bird, but in a can of dog food, it might be 20 or 30%. You just don't know. And they've just found very deceptive ways of packaging and labeling their products so that dog owners really don't know what
Yeah.
they're feeding their dogs. That's the bottom line. So we
I
need
know.
to know what we're putting in the bowl.
Yeah, I know how difficult it was for me when I was trying to feed raw at first and trying to figure out, I was too nervous to do it myself, so I was relying on commercial raw, and I was trying to figure out when I was starting rotational monofeeding, well, how much fat is in here? I couldn't even figure it out because the label isn't explicit in how
Right.
much fat, but you think it is because it's very deceptive how they put it on there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
They'll give you the percentage, but it'll say minimum. And people don't think about what minimum means. Well, that means this this percentage, that's the very least that is in this product. And what you want
yeah.
to know is what's actually in there.
Hmm.
So it's anyway, yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the AAFCO, what that means in terms of dog nutrition?
Well, it's a voluntary system supposedly, but I think it sort of gets support from the state-run systems, the state governments, because I don't actually know how much authority they have to exert their requirements
Hmm.
um, for dog food producers putting in a certain amount of protein or a certain amount of this. They have requirements. Most dog food producers go along with them, and it's basically it's meaningless
Yeah,
because what we discovered in the way we're feeding is this is what works, but this is what AFCO is requiring. It's AAF's, it's Animal Association of Animal Feed something or other. Anyway, it's the body that governs apparently all of commercial animal feeding products.
hmm,
Um, so but this balance thing, these requirements that they have in there, well, the food has to have a certain amount of protein, it has to have a certain amount of fat, and that those requirements were made a long time ago when producers were using cereals instead of meat. So they wanted to make sure that there was enough protein and fat in the product. And that's where these required percentages comes from. And that's probably where the minimum comes from too, because they
yeah.
wanted to make sure that the minimum was in there. And it's just a very outdated, industry supporting, self-serving, profiting system, and we need to just step away from it.
It's always eye-opening to learn about where these things come from and how they got started and
Yeah,
how over time they become less useful in
obsolete.
a lot of
Right,
ways. Yeah.
right.
So what are some of the early experiences that you had that led you to believe, hey, I might be doing something that's working a whole lot better than what's being sold out there?
Right. Well, everybody's had those horrible experiences where you think you're feeding your dog a really good food, and if you even connect the condition of the dog with the food, and a lot of people don't because vets don't do that.
Hmm.
But you think you're doing everything right and your dog is just chronically sick. And I had those experiences too. I mean, it's heartbreaking to just watch your animal die and listen to a vet say, well, we don't know what caused it. I mean, I had a cat die when he was 11 of peritonitis, and this is supposed to be something that is caught, right? It's
Right.
supposed to be um, a communicable disease. Well, my cat was indoor only.
Hmm.
And so my vet had to really look for what might have caused this. And when he found out that I was volunteering in an animal shelter, he speculated that I had brought it home with me. And so I had to listen. He was talking to me on the phone when my cat was dying, and I could hear my cat. This was a very silent cat. He never complained, and I could hear my cat crying in the background. It was horrible. And so I had to go, okay, well, I brought this sickness home to my cat. That's where my head was in those days. Everybody's
Right.
is, we're
Hmm.
all indoctrinated with that stuff. So that was, one little experience, very disillusioning experience. And then I had a dog also that was 16, and she was in and out of the vet's office her whole life, miserable ear problems, skin problems, never got to the root of it. And, finally she died at age 16. And then I got another dog. And I was determined to use all of the information that I had when I got him to keeping him healthy. And unfortunately, I didn't have a lot of information at the time. It was in the early 90s, and information wasn't easy to come by. But I fed him raw food, and
Mhm.
I thought, just feeding raw is so ahead of the curve. It's just so, it puts him ahead of other dogs that I didn't really have to worry about bones or that there was too much fat in the food or anything. And a lot of what I was feeding him was just ground, just cheap ground turkey. I just
Mhm.
thought, well, it's better than dog food, right? I mean,
Mhm.
my dog's going to live forever. Well, he did live a really long life, but he went deaf at age 9 because of his chronic ear issues, ear
Mhm.
inflammation. And it happened pretty quick. I mean, he had recurring ear issues, but then he had a bad one, and within 2 weeks he was deaf. So for the rest of his life he had to be deaf. And at that point I started trying to figure out um, what I had done wrong. And I did finally settle on that it was mostly the fat in his diet that was producing so much waste in his body that his primary organs of elimination couldn't keep up. And that stuff has to go somewhere. So it went, for his
Mhm.
body sent that extra waste out the ear canal.
Mhm.
And that's a sacrifice that the body makes. And the sacrifice is, if the body, from the body's perspective, you let that stuff stay in place, and you're going to have a malfunctioning liver or a
Mhm.
malfunctioning heart. Well, that's going to shorten the life. But if you send it out through the ear canal, the dog will just be deaf. At
Mhm.
least there'll be life. So it's a cost benefit thing that the body does. What we have to do is find out why that stuff is coming out the ears and coming out the skin and the eyes and all of that and between the pads, and stop all of this waste production in the body.
Mhm. Were any of your dogs fasting themselves or anything at the time when this was happening?
No, nobody, I mean, all my dogs have been, wanting to eat all of the time. The only experience I had with fasting was I had a cat that was injured, and this was Herbie. I have a little essay on my website about Herbie because he had a pretty long life, but he had a bit of an adventure at the end of it with a neighbor that fed him commercial cat food. But anyway, he was injured. I suspect that he crawled up into a car and got too near the fan when
Mhm.
the person started it, and it just lacerated the inside of his leg, and it
Mhm.
was a very deep cut. And um, I didn't take him to the vet because he absolutely hated leaving home. I didn't want to subject him to that, and he was already very traumatized. And by that time, I was realizing that the best way for animals to heal is for us to just keep our hands off and let their bodies do the work when we can do that. I mean, when a
Mhm.
bone needs to be set, that's different. When blood loss needs to be stopped, that's different. There's a time for that. There's an occasion when you have to do that. But in this case, he just fasted himself for 10 days. He hid under my house for 10 days. I offered him food every day. I don't remember if he came out, it was a long time ago. I don't remember if he came out on his own or if I enticed him out with food, but he would not eat
Mhm.
until the 10th day, and he ate. And that was the first day that he put weight on his leg. So at that point, I knew that I had done the right thing and it was going to heal on its own. And he was fine from that point
Mhm.
on.
Yeah.
Um, so that's the only experience I had with fasting until I started to learn more about it. And the Coco, my little cocker spaniel cockapoo who's had gone deaf, I
Mhm.
decided to fast him um, and really get his ears cleaned out. And I fasted him for 11 days the first
Mhm.
time, and he rejuvenated. He turned into a puppy again. I've told this story a few times where my mom didn't see him for a whole year. And when she saw him after a year, he had fasted in the meantime. And she thought I had gotten a new puppy because she didn't
Yeah.
recognize him.
Mhm.
He was, so he never had another ear infection his whole life, no more ear inflammation. Unfortunately, those nerves in his ear were damaged because of the waste coming out, and his hearing did not come back. but he didn't have any more inflammation, and he had actually no more vet visits for the remaining 11 years of his life, which is, pretty remarkable on its own.
Yeah. It mentioned feeding some ground beef or ground turkey, I think it was.
Mhm.
And that wasn't exactly, you did discover that wasn't exactly the best thing to do, but it was an improvement. What is the best way to feed the dogs?
Well, that's kind of an open question because there's lots of variation between individual dogs, and there might be lots of variation between breeds of dogs. Um, but I do have a system that's sort of, in fact, it's very customizable for dog owners, depending mostly on what they want to feed, because we don't really know what dogs need. Um, People like to pretend that they know what dogs need. They like to pretend they know how much dogs need, and nobody really knows that. All we know is what we see dogs doing in nature. And,
Mm-hmm.
there's no wild humans we can watch, but there's wild dogs we can watch. And there are people that watch them, and they take lots of notes and make observations. And we can glean information from that that's really important, and that we shouldn't ignore. Um, but what we can do is compare what a wild dog eats to what a normal domestic dog eats, and then we can see the deficiencies and the
Mm-hmm.
excesses in the diet of the domestic dog. So what we have to do at that point is to set about correcting those deficiencies and excesses. Um, and in fact, it's mostly excesses. I don't like to say that D word because that gets people starting to think about supplements and whatnot.
Yeah.
So that deficiency word. So it's mostly excess because, when you realize all of these problems with the way domestic dogs are fed are really a function of how the pet food industry functions and what they
Yeah.
use and what they put in their products and how they lie to us about it.
Mm-hmm.
So the perfect way to feed a dog is an open question, but we have a range. We have some general principles that can guide us. Like, we know that they eat the bodies of ungulates, elk and deer. We know they eat the bodies of rodents, rabbits, and mice, and they eat fish. They've been, observed fishing right out of
Mm-hmm.
streams, and we also observe that they have these bouts with prey scarcity, so they eat secondary foods. Like I said in the last video, apples, berries, they eat out of orchards. Um, Dogs have been seen eating plums. They love figs. So what we can do is sort of fashion together something that more or less replicates what a wild dog would eat. And we have to make some adjustments because, number one, our dogs aren't chasing their food down. They're not traveling 10 to 50 miles a day to get fed. Um, and number two, the foods that we feed aren't of the quality that a wild dog would get. Wild foods are the best foods.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but we can do that and still be way ahead of commercial feeders, even if we just buy foods in the regular grocery store. And when I started putting my whole little program together, I wanted it to be accessible. I wanted everybody to be able to get what they need in a grocery store. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what I do. Yeah, I found a couple of stores that sell things, like beef heart. You don't usually see beef heart in a Safeway store or whatever.
Right.
Um, so you might have to look around a little bit. You might have to, call a butcher and see if you can order something like that. But for the most part, especially with small to medium dogs, you can get everything you need in a regular grocery store.
Mm-hmm.
So we can talk about the specifics about that if you'd like.
Okay. Yeah, like what are the basic guiding principles of rotational monofeeding in terms of diet? Incorporating more plant foods to mimic, the diet of wolves and to help reduce the fat and all of those things. Let's talk about each of those, each
Right.
of the components of. what makes up this whole rotational monofeeding, not just diet, but philosophy
Right,
in terms of healthcare also.
right. Well, plant foods can make up anywhere from, you know, 50 to 80% of the diet or
Mhm.
less, maybe even 20%. You can feed your dog plant foods 1 or 2 days a week and then meat the rest of the days. Or you can do it the other way around with, more plants than meat. The thing that you have to do, you have to experiment a bit with your own dog. And there are some baseline protocols that I use, like, just if you're unsure, start with a 3-to-1. So you feed plant foods 3 days and then you have a meat meal and then you start the whole thing over again. And plant days can consist of fruit if your dog will eat fruit. If your dog won't eat fruit, you might want to fast for a day to clean out the system and make it more. You sort of just have to replicate that prey scarcity situation that forces dogs, you know, by their biological instincts to eat secondary foods in the wild. The aim is really because these products that come from the animal agriculture industry are so fatty and so full of stored waste from the foods that those animals were fed. That's really what we have to guard against. And that's what we have to minimize. And feeding plant foods on these, few days of the week will do that. And fasting will do the same. What I discovered is that people didn't want to do that. They don't want to feed their dog every other day. They want to feed their dog every day. This is a habit that people are just not willing to give up.
Mhm.
And understandably, there's a stigma that if you don't feed your dog every day, that that you're being
Yeah.
neglectful. So anyway, go ahead. Anyway, that's why I started introducing plant meals instead of just
Yeah.
saying, hey, feed your dog every other day, feed your dog every third day.
You mentioned something really quickly, but I think it's important to emphasize it, and that is that most people don't realize that toxins are stored in fat, and in the fat of the animals that we eat, in our own fat. Um, and so that's really an important reason for trying or attempting to reduce the amount of fat, because we don't want to not only create toxins, but we don't want to be ingesting them either.
Right, and that's what obesity is about. And the animal food producers have discovered that a long time ago. All they have to do is feed the equivalent of McDonald's and fast food, and worse than that. I mean, far worse than that. Um, to their animals, and their animals will get obese. They have to just feed those crappy foods to their animals. They have to make sure their animals don't move very much,
Hmm.
and that's a recipe for obesity.
Yeah.
And when our animals eat those foods, that they become obese as well.
Yeah.
And it's the waste. It gets introduced to the whole chain, the whole stream, by the animal food producer in the first place. And it's accepted. It doesn't get talked about very much. It's just something that they do. But it's very damaging. It's very damaging to those animals that they're raising. Those animals
Hmm.
they're raising are diseased, so they have to be drugged so that they don't die. And they're kept on, some, semblance of life by with drugs and injections and whatnot. All of that stuff is stored in the fat cells. And that's why it's so important for us to get rid of the fat, because nobody else does it along the supply chain. It just
Hmm.
comes all the way down to us.
Yeah. I think by now most people realize, kibble, no matter how top of the line or whatever it is nowhere near an appropriate dog for foods, but there might, or appropriate
Yeah.
food for dogs.
Mm-hmm.
But there might be people out there who are feeding PMR, and we'll discuss what that is, or BARF, which are raw food meals, um, who maybe think, I'm doing this already. So let's talk about the difference between rotational monofeeding and regular raw food diets. I know when I started looking into feeding my dogs raw, and they were raw fed before starting rotational monofeeding, um, I quickly discovered, that there were basically two camps. There was the PMR and BARF camps. And PMR, for those who don't know, stands for Prey Model Raw, which is a modified method of whole prey feeding that kind of mimics the ratio of muscle, meat, bone, and organs found in whole small prey. And then there's BARF, which stands for biologically appropriate raw food. And the BARF model, it's more popular of the two, and it includes fruits, veggies, seeds, and nuts. And many of the commercial raw brands are BARF, and that's what I used. I used several of the commercial raw brands before changing to rotational monofeeding. So could you talk a little bit about each of these feeding methods? First, what's wrong with the PMR method?
Well, the methods that we use incorporate parts of both of those. We just leave out the mistakes. And the mistakes of PMR is they do tend to they put other things besides prey in the bowl, in the, dish that they feed their dog. They give things like turmeric paste, golden paste, coconut oil, dairy products, those kinds of things. Um, but the main thing is they way overfeed their dogs typically, and that's what causes the disease that they still encounter, the skin issues they still encounter. Um, and and so what we do is we just take 1 or 2 days per week of prey model feeding, and then we just do something different for the other days, and that
Hmm.
protects the dog from getting too much of what they would get if they were fed PMR every day. And BARF, the BARF methods has makes mistakes too. They put lots of different foods, incompatible foods together. And it's very complicated. They tend to use a lot of supplementation and oils, things that are really useless to a dog's body. And a young dog starting out on either one of those plans might do fine for a while. And uh, as a dog gets older, their capacity for eliminating waste decreases. So people typically find out in midlife that their dog is having a symptom, and they think that they're already doing everything perfectly, especially if they've had 5 years of practice under their belt
Hmm.
and reading and communing with other baller feeders or PMR feeders or whatever, and talking and reading. um, and it doesn't occur to them that it's the diet that's causing it.
Right.
So that's where loyalty to a plan can get you in trouble. And when people switch to my methods of feeding, I don't ask for that kind of loyalty. If there's a symptom, you need to figure out what's wrong and tweak it and change it. And that's why there's so much range between protocols,
Hmm.
between feeding protocols. And if
Yeah.
you find that one's not working, it needs to be changed, because that's the first thing to look at. Diet is number one. It's the first thing to look at
Yeah.
when things go wrong.
Yeah, I think people underestimate that. When I've done PMR and BARF, and I was BARF feeding my dogs before moving to rotational monofeeding, and I was paying top dollar, AFCO approved, whatever, balanced, fancy commercial raw dog food brands, and I was still having problems. My dogs had early stage kidney disease, mast cell cancer, chronic allergies, and you wouldn't think that just combining the meat with the plant materials and feeding that meal, which included much more fat than should be in there,
Mhm,
every day would have such a huge impact, but it does.
mhm,
And people are amazed when they start cutting down on the amount of fat that goes in and separating out those plant food types so that they can digest easily, and not require so much energy from our dogs.
mhm.
Yeah.
It really comes down to one problem, and that is commercialism, because it has to be cheap, it has to make money, and that's not, we don't care about that.
Yeah.
Because it's not actually just a matter of, food combining or whatever, because I've seen people in various groups talk about they keep their dogs' fat consumption fairly low, but
Mhm.
they do mix veggies and fruits in with the food,
Yeah.
and their dogs are fine. So it's
And
not just that. I really think it's mostly the commercialism.
yeah. And probably why that is effective is because the body is not overburdened with digestion, and it has energy that it can devote to cellular regeneration and healing, because they're not bombarded with a big meal every day, and
Right.
digesting food constantly. And that goes back to the whole philosophy of natural hygiene. Can you talk about that and how that plays a part in the rotational monofeeding?
Well, natural hygiene really is the science of health. It's just observations that have been made for the last, couple hundred years of what works in nature, and trying to figure out what our biological requirements are and what the biological requirements of our dogs. And when we do that, disease goes away. Disease is a result of our failure to do that. Um, so it's all about removal of cause, not treating, and allowing the magnificent, incredibly beyond comprehensible wisdom of the body, to heal itself.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're doing here. We're taking away the cause and allowing the body to heal itself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lot of brainwashing that goes on, for the medical industry, and people come to this expecting very quick results. Sometimes they get quick results, and that's great. Sometimes it's slower, and typically it's when a dog is older that healing is slower.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it happens in cycles, like you saw with your dogs. But when you see stuff coming out the ears, stuff coming out the eyes, I mean, people ask me all the time, how much longer is this going to go on? How much longer do I have to, watch my dog have stuff coming out of her eyes or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
And nobody knows that. What I can do is I can take a look at what you're feeding and find out if it's something that you're feeding right now that
Yeah.
might be causing an abundance of waste to come out through these, superfluous avenues. But short of knowing what you're feeding now, I just have to assume that it's because the body has gotten a break from what it was being fed before, and now it's able to go deep and get all of those stored wastes out, and it's using the same channels that it did before. They're already set up. They're
Mm-hmm.
little engineering marvels of the body.
Yeah.
Skin eruptions they're called eruptions because they're like little volcanoes. They're pushing stuff out. And when you understand that, then you have to go, well, where is all this stuff coming from?
Yeah.
It's not, it's not a germ, it's not a bacteria, it's big stuff. It's big. It's stuff it's accumulated so much in the body that it has to find an outbound route. And that's what's happening. So
What is it? Why does it work for so many things? Like we people come in, and learn about the rotational monofeeding in your Facebook group, Healing Diet for Dogs and Cats, and the majority have allergies, actually, allergies.
yeah.
Um, but everybody has something different going on, and they want to know what they can do for their specific disease. So why is that not necessarily the thing to focus on?
That's a great question, because everybody thinks that there's a different thing to do for every specific disease. And that's a commercial. That's a commercial for
Mm-hmm.
products that replays on our head. Okay, so if I have acne, I need something that treats acne. Or if I
Mm-hmm.
have, colitis or whatever, I need a product that treats colitis. Well, the same thing that causes colitis causes acne. It's exactly the same thing. It's stuff coming out. If you're putting in, foods that your body can't digest, and it has to be eliminated through those primary organs of elimination. And when that happens, if those foods and those wastes are irritating, they're going to produce that consequence in the colon. and and the same for, same for acne. It's stuff finding an outbound avenue, because if it stayed put, it would wreak havoc with the vital organs. And vital organs are what's important, not the skin. you
Why
know
do you think it comes out as allergies in one dog, out the skin in one dog, inflammation in the ear in another dog, and kidney disease in another dog?
yeah, that's a great question. And nobody knows the answer to that. That's probably in the genes. And before anybody, leaps to the conclusion that what I'm saying is that disease is genetic, genes only determine where in your body your disease is going to manifest. It doesn't make you diseased.
Hmm.
What you feed your dog makes your dog diseased.
Yeah,
And where it shows up is a matter of the genes that he got from his parents and their parents, and on and on. I don't know why why my cockapoo had ear issues. I can only assume that he had a big flap. It tends to keep air from evaporating. It gets very moist in there, and the waste piles up and invites, bacteria to clean it up. And so we can conclude that big ear flaps probably contribute, but they're not the primary cause. The primary cause is the waste that's coming through the ear canal.
right. And why is it not a good idea to resort to treating it to help relieve the pain and suffering that's happening?
Well, that's a balancing act, because there are things you can do that will relieve the symptom a bit without stopping the process that's happening. And um, if you do, if you give something internal, and that stops this process from happening. And that's what the medical industry, the pet sickness industry, is famous for: stopping the symptom, and forcing those wastes to
Hmm.
not come through. um, they're just going to stay there. They're going to stay put, and they're going to have to come out another way. So even though that's the way most people handle disease, it's absolutely the wrong way. What
Hmm.
you need to do is just stop the waste from coming in and allow the body to clean out. And, like we covered in the last video, when stuff gets liberated back into the bloodstream from its stored locations on the body, it triggers those same symptoms. It can still come through the skin. It can still come through the ears and eyes.
Hmm.
Um, typically you don't get symptoms that are as severe as when the stuff was still going in every day, but it can be severe for a while. And you just have to know and have faith that it's a temporary process.
Yeah,
And some dogs their symptoms have been suppressed with drugs for years, so they not only have all of those wastes that have been retained, they have very harmful substances that the body has also stored along with them, that are going to cause irritation and inflammation when they do come out. So that's why we see
yeah,
so much redness and inflammation, and all of those, you know horrible
yeah.
symptoms when
A
dogs.
lot of I've noticed in the Facebook group that it seems to me that most of those who have really harsh detox symptoms are the ones who have taken those drugs, like the preventatives and the Apoquel
Mhm,
and all
mhm,
those types of drugs. Very
mhm.
nasty drugs,
Yes.
cause a lot of
Yeah.
problems.
Yes, just chronic use, repeated use of the drugs, and they burden the body so.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
it can make a very tough, detox for the
Yeah,
dog.
and there's ways to mitigate the speed at which detox occurs to some
Yes.
degree with diet.
Yeah, absolutely. Because what we found is that plant foods go through the system very quickly and easily. And meat, even though dogs need meat, it's a very energy intense, it's a very labor intensive thing to digest,
Hmm.
and it moves slower through the body. And it's sort of a bridge between, like, especially if a dog's coming from strictly being fed PMR or barf diet or whatever, a high meat rotation is actually closer to that previous diet than it is to a high plant rotation. So it's sort of a bridge, provides a bridge between the two and can slow down the detox. On the other end, you have, fasting. If you fast your dog, that's the fastest way. So they might get severe symptoms, but it'll be very short-lived. So it's a
Yeah.
balancing act that only the owner can decide
Mm-hmm.
on.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I love about the Facebook group is there are over 7,000 people in there, and they do help each other
Mhm, mhm.
through those periods. And for the most part, most dogs don't have severe symptoms. It's the few that have really used a lot of drugs, especially that I've noticed have been more
Yeah.
difficult.
Yeah, and owners can see these detox symptoms as a sign of trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And if they don't understand that it's not necessarily a sign of trouble, and in fact, it's probably not a sign of trouble,
Mm-hmm.
it can strike fear in them. So people really do have to educate themselves. They have to work on that. And that takes a little bit of reading and understanding,
Yeah.
rethinking things.
Right. And then once you're through it and you've actually seen everything firsthand yourself, there's no going back. It's like
Right.
you're completely convinced, you know?
Right. Yeah, you have that
Yeah.
experience.
What about puppies? Because they're a little different. First of all, they haven't been on the planet that long, so they haven't really had a chance to build up a lot of toxicity. Do you recommend the same thing for puppies that you do for adult dogs? And at what age would you change things up?
I do. I think it'd be great if all puppies were weaned onto, regular food instead of commercial dog food. But usually when people acquire a puppy, the puppy has been weaned onto commercial food. So you do have a bit of detox when you start all of that. And that takes various, forms too. And it can there's a lot of fear around sick puppies
Mm-hmm.
because of the parvo boogeyman thing that the
Yeah.
vet industry has laid on us. But, it's fairly short-lived if you do things right. And with puppies, you kind of have to experiment a bit even more because they're learning potty training, and plant foods create lots of potty and lots of potty trips. So you have to balance that against what you want to feed. I wanted to feed my puppy lots of plant foods when she
Mm-hmm.
was growing up, but it surprised her when those plant foods would come through fast, and she didn't know what to do about it, and we had accidents. So I went back to feeding her just prey model raw,
Yeah.
low fat prey model raw for the first year. And she's a puppy. Puppies eliminate very quickly. It's hard to overwhelm a puppy, and that's a testament to their resilience, that so many of them do get overwhelmed by being weaned onto commercial food.
Mm-hmm.
But so I did that with my puppy. I've heard from other puppy owners that they didn't have to do that. They could feed plant foods, and it didn't interrupt the potty training issue.
Potty training is a big deal, though. So
Yeah, yeah,
that is definitely a reason to feed meat more frequently for puppies.
right.
Um, you can't talk about nutrition without talking about the keto craze. I know that was a big deal when I had a dog who had cancer about 5 or 7 years ago. And I even contacted one of the keto places that designed a diet for him. It actually ended up facilitating his death, and now I know why. Can you explain why that diet is so harmful and disease causing?
Yeah, well, it's a disaster for for humans. People don't like to hear that because it does work for losing weight. If that's all you care about is losing weight, keto works because your body can't store protein. And what keto does for humans is it gets the processed grain products out of their diets. It gets
Mm,
the processed foods in general out of their diet. So people lose weight, they think it's great. And that makes them ironically more open to feeding meat to their dogs, feeding real food to their dogs.
yeah.
I've seen this trend of people coming into the group who say, yeah, I'm on keto myself, so I'm all over feeding meat to my dogs, even if it's raw meat and
Hmm.
bones and whatever. So unfortunately, it's a it's a modified, for dogs, it's sort of a modified PMR diet, and it has the same problems. It doesn't correct the problems of PMR. It adds to them, actually, because
Mhm.
keto invites a lot of fat into the diet. But it also makes people carbohydrate phobic,
Mhm.
and PMR feeders and people who are following a keto diet for themselves, they tend to lump all carbohydrates together, and there are some carbs that absolutely do not belong in a human or canine body. And when you get rid of those, everybody's going to be healthier. But you can't put all carbs in the same category. Fruit is a carbohydrate. Vegetables are carbohydrates. The quinoa that we feed dogs is a carbohydrate. And even though it's a high protein carbohydrate, it's still a carbohydrate. But so that might be an adjustment for people to get used to feeding their dog plant foods and understanding why we feed plant foods. It's really not so much that dogs need plant foods in their diet, because a well-situated dog out in the wild might get by without ever eating plant
Mhm.
foods. It could happen. They live in a very populous, rabbit populous area or something. The
Yeah.
Arctic wolves eat, mice all day long, so they might not ever have to eat plant foods. But what it does in the domestic dog's diet is it prevents that overconsumption of very high value, rich foods, and very high fat foods like meat.
Right.
So,
And helps the owner who may be fasting averse. Gives them
right.
a meal to feed.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah. A
exactly. It's more
harmless
for
a
the owner.
harmless meal. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Mhm. Um, let's talk a little bit about bile vomiting. It's actually the topic that led me to you because
Mhm.
Olive was vomiting like clockwork every single morning, 5:30. Would wake up and vomit for weeks. And so I started looking online to see if I could find out why this was happening. She was being fed a barf diet at the time, and I came across an article that you had written, and that's how I discovered rotational monofeeding. Couldn't believe that it helped it so quickly, and she stopped doing it literally like the day after I started. I fasted her, started her on plant foods, and then there's no more bile vomiting. I don't know if
Mhm.
it happens that quickly with everyone. It doesn't seem like it, but can you talk a little bit about what that is and how you can fix it?
Yeah, it was kind of a byproduct. My discovery of that was kind of a byproduct of my discovering that fat was what was causing my dog's ear inflammation,
Hmm.
because he was also bile vomiting very regularly, especially when I was in the kitchen preparing his food. He would vomit bile. And so I put all these pieces together, and I don't think anybody, at least I've never read that anybody else has done that before and figured
Yeah.
out what's actually causing this thing. Because what vets and others have found out is that if you keep food in the stomach very frequently, then that bile that's being backed up into the stomach for some reason, and I think it's because it's being overproduced because there's so much fat in the diet,
Yeah.
that bile that gets backed up into the stomach is never concentrated because it's always diluted by the presence of food.
Mm.
So if you just feed the dog more frequently, then they won't vomit bile. But that's not a solution to the problem.
Right.
That leads to overfeeding, and then you still have the fat issue. And that overfeeding of fat is not only going to cause bile to overproduce, it's also going to create other problems in the body. So what you want to do
Right.
is you want to find out what's causing the bile to be overproduced, and do something about that. So people find sometimes when they come to this way of feeding and they want to fast their dogs, they really do understand the power of fasting. They're into it themselves, they want to do that for
Mhm.
their dogs, but their dogs vomit bile. And it's a matter of personal preference, really. But some people say that they can't stand to see their dog vomiting bile. And you have to think it's very uncomfortable for a dog for that to happen. Other people just say that they, power through it
Mhm.
and put up with it. And sometimes when dogs have that problem, even feeding doesn't solve it because
Right.
you have this mess in the stomach, and the dog will sometimes vomit the whole meal.
Yeah.
So anyway, the best way is to just lower the fat content. It didn't
Mhm.
happen quickly with my dog. My dog was 9 when I started making these, changes
Mhm.
to his diet with fat. And it took probably a year for him to stop vomiting bile completely. And I
Interesting.
noticed that problem with my puppy too. When after that year that I fed her PMR,
Yeah.
she was vomiting bile, and she
Hmm.
never vomits bile, never. And that was she'll be 3 next month, and so it's 2 years now. That so it just seems very clear to me that that's the answer to the mystery. And
When
um,
she started vomiting your puppy bile, did you start plant foods immediately? Did you fast? What did you do?
I at that point started a high plant rotation. I mean, I shouldn't say high plant because we gradually moved to that. I think I probably started with a one-on-one, or
Mhm.
maybe even less, like one plant food a week to see how she would do.
Yeah.
And even then, we still had a few problems. So I very gradually added
Okay.
the plant foods in, and I think that's a solution for people because it's an easy way for a dog to heal, to eat
Yeah.
plant foods.
When you are feeding commercial food, it's right there on the bag. It tells you how much you're to feed. And so when you start out home cooking, um, it's not really cooking. In some ways it's cooking, in some it's not. But when you start out creating these meals, you never know how much to feed. And there seems to be a wide range, and it depends on a lot of factors. So could you help our viewers kind of understand how you figure that out?
Yeah, it does depend on a lot of factors, and the bottom line is that nobody knows how much food your dog needs, and it requires a bit of experimentation, and people who are really dependent on those labels, those dog food labels, to tell them how much to feed their dogs, are going to feel like they're stepping off a cliff
Mhm.
to not be told how much they're supposed to feed. So what we've done is we've come up with a range. And if you're feeding a high meat rotation, which means, you're feeding one plant day a week or two, something like that, and the rest are meat days, you might want to start on the low end because meat is so dense in fuel, um, and it's less dilute than the plant foods that we feed. So, but if you're starting on a high plant food rotation, you're going to be wanting to feed somewhere, and this is by weight
Mhm.
only, 3 to 10% of the dog's body weight. So what we have calculations that we use on our group so that people can figure this out easily. But you just take the dog's weight times 16 ounces in the case of our
Yeah.
system here, and divide or multiply by 0.03 if you want 3%, or 0.07 if you want 7. And to pick somewhere between the 3 to 10% to start with is totally fine. I mean,
Yeah.
if you want to start with 3% of body weight for meat days and 6% body weight, that's probably a good starting point for just
Mhm.
about every dog.
Yeah. And I think it's okay. You can fast your dog for several days, and they're going to be fine. It's like people really start to freak out that, oh, if I don't give my dog this exact amount of food, that something's going to go haywire. But after you've gotten used to feeding your dog this way, it's no problem at all making adjustments as you go along. And I think most people will
Right.
discover that you can start out within that big range, and then you can just adjust over time, whether it means, throwing in an extra meat day, or adding a few more plants to your plant meals, or reducing it. If I notice that Blue's getting a little chunky, I just I'll fast him an extra day.
Exactly. And you know what that does for people? It gives you all the power.
Mhm.
That is an educational process because it tells you exactly what your dog needs and nobody else knows. Nobody else can tell you what your dog needs. But at the end of that process, when he has symptoms, oh, you've had too many meat days or too much, food overall. That's what I do with my dog. I mean, I see a little itching and I go, well, we'll skip breakfast tomorrow
Yeah.
and the itching goes away. You don't wait until it gets really bad. I mean, it just becomes so obvious when you think these things all the way through why we've been taught this. Because if you let things build up and pile up and get really bad, it doesn't serve anybody except that industry, that
Right.
fitness industry.
Mhm. Let's talk about specific foods because everybody loves feeding their dogs foods that they also love. I really
Hmm.
enjoy feeding my dogs watermelon because I love watermelon, and sometimes we'll just take like a half of a huge watermelon out in the yard because it's super messy. And I'll eat it, and they'll eat it. And what kind of plant foods can you feed these dogs on plant days?
Dogs like all kinds of sweet fruits. Usually citrus is rejected by dogs. Dogs
Hmm.
don't typically eat grapefruits or lemons, or, some will eat oranges. Oranges are sweet. Um, but berries sometimes come through intact, so they have trouble sometimes with like blueberries from the grocery store. The some of the fruits that we feed from the grocery store have been hybridized so that they're very shelf stable, and that sometimes means that the skin, the membrane, whatever, is thicker than it would be out in
Yeah.
the wild. So you might see a dog eating lots of blueberries out in the wild and digesting them just fine, but you might see whole blueberries coming out of your dog. So in that case, whenever you see something whole coming out, you want to process it a little more, maybe puree it, mash it, or stop feeding that food temporarily in the meantime if you're already doing that. So sometimes that's kind of a disguise. You won't be able to tell that the dog's not digesting it. If you're pureeing it, it might come out whole. It might come out the same way it went in, but it's going to look the same,
Hmm.
and the dog won't have digested it. So, but pureeing in theory does help.
Yeah.
Um, so any kind of fruit. Right now I'm feeding my dog lots of apricots because I
Mhm.
have lots of tree ripened apricots right now, and she loves them. They're very dense, they're very sweet.
Mhm.
Dogs love figs. In the winter it's a little harder, but dogs love pears, they love apples, grapes, believe it or not. Lots of our members feed grapes, and
Mhm.
that's a whole topic on its own. But cooked yams, like we covered in the last video, cooked
Mhm.
yams, cooked quinoa. Um, and that's pretty much it. A
Yeah.
lot of people do feed their dogs cooked vegetables. I'm not really big on vegetables. They have some mineral matter that's harmed in the
Question.
cooking process.
Yeah.
And they don't have much sugar.
Mhm.
So if the minerals are harmed and they don't have much sugar and they've got a lot of cellulose, the cellulose is broken down a bit by the cooking process. But what all that adds up to is there's not much left for the
Mhm.
dog. So
Yeah.
vegetables for us and for dogs are overrated. I
Yeah.
tend to feed sweet foods to dogs. They love melons too. I forgot to mention
Mhm.
melons. Melons should
Mhm.
probably be fed alone because they ferment very quickly.
Yeah.
They either digest or ferment very quickly. So if they're fed with other foods, um, they can cause a bit of, flatulence or
Yeah.
whatever. Um, so I don't feed
On
melons
the
with other food.
on the fruits, I guess a good rule of thumb, and I've heard you say this before, is if they don't want to eat it, then it's probably not something, that you should feed. Or unless you're dealing with a dog, I guess, that doesn't want to eat any fruit whatsoever, in which case, it would be a good idea to fast the dog to see if then they would then accept. And if not, then keep trying over time because a lot of dogs actually come around and end up loving their plant
Right.
their plant meals.
Yeah, like we covered in the last video, you can
Yeah.
randomize things. You can use tempting little disguises to get the dog sort of fooled into eating the food, and eventually take away the disguise and they discover that they still like the food.
Mhm.
So, and some of those disguises are coconut. You can flaked coconut, make sure that it's
Mhm.
unsweetened on fruit, or you can make a little sauce out of peanut butter and put it on fruit.
Yeah.
Um, you can mix fruit with quinoa. My dog was a little reluctant to eat fruit on its own initially, but
Mhm.
she loves it now. And, I keep her slim, and that's what we have to do. We really, dogs are lean in the wild.
Yeah.
They developed in, really harsh economies where it was hard to get food. And that's the model. That's their
Yeah.
biological mandate. So,
What about meats? Do we have to be concerned with all these different ratios and organs and all of that? I know that's one reason I did commercial feeding initially when I moved
mhm,
to raw because it was so freaking confusing and I didn't know how to make make my own kind of meal
right.
with all the
Well,
rules.
yeah, that's it's hard for people to know, with all of this talk in the PMR circles of ratios and whatnot, it can be very intimidating. So that's why I recommend for people just starting out to just feed Cornish game hens. It's the whole animal.
Mhm.
Everything's in there. You have to look closely, but the heart is there, the liver is there, all the little, hormone secreting organs are there, except the digestive tract. They do remove that, and the head. But everything else is there. It's all provided for you. You just have to remove the fat. But, that gets a little prohibitive for people with many dogs or with big
Mhm.
dogs. Um, so I feed the only fit liver that the only organ meat actually that my dog gets, I give her heart, but that's not really an organ. That's more of a
Yeah.
muscle. It's just muscle meat. It's like steak.
Yeah.
But she gets liver, and the only form that she gets that in is dehydrated, and that's the only organ meat that she gets.
Mine too.
And really, and I mean, that's it it that's what works. I mean, I did the same thing with my last dog, and I haven't seen any sign of this, needing to make sure that they get this X amount of organs every day. I don't
Right.
think that comes from any real science.
Yeah.
um
What
but
other what other things would be acceptable that you can get at the grocery store in terms of meats or cuts of meats? Like a lot of people who don't eat meat don't even know what to buy when they go to
right.
that meat
Yeah.
section.
Yeah. Yeah, that can be intimidating for people too. And the bone issue too is
Yeah.
huge. But as far as how much to feed in terms of bone, it really depends on the poops, because you're just adding bone basically to keep the poop solid. And presumably there's stuff in the bones. Obviously there's stuff in the bones that dogs need. They need the minerals. And it's normal for dogs to eat bones. Um, and I guess the ratio is 10% or 20% or something like that. I don't use those ratios,
Hmm.
but then I'm feeding my dog when she eats meat. I'm feeding her mostly Cornish game hens, which has the bone already in there. It's very
Right.
natural, little animal. Um, so I would say, I do feed another 70-pound dog, and I feed her mostly beef heart and chicken legs and turkey necks, and she does just fine. She has beautiful poops. She's been on this plan for about a year and a half,
Hmm.
and her poops are always solid. I just make sure that her meals are roughly 50% bone, um, bony meat, and 50% some kind of lean meat like beef heart or
Okay.
pork, sometimes pork.
Hmm.
But
What about fish? What are your feelings on fish?
No, I haven't fed fish very much because even though I live in a coastal area, I don't find fish to be very affordable. And
Hmm.
I used to offer it to my other dog occasionally, and I really only offered him smelt because that's what I bought for my cat, which
Hmm.
is what sardines are made out of, just very small fish,
Yeah.
because it's the whole animal. It's everything is in
Yeah.
there. And he would eat them sometimes, and he would very often vomit when
Hmm.
he did eat them. So I tried
Mm-hmm.
them a few times, and finally he just refused to eat them.
Okay.
So that's really all the experience I have with fish. Once in a while, I'll buy salmon for my cat. Fish bones are fine. All of if people have, some people have, husbands that go out and fish or
Mm-hmm.
whatever, and a freezer full of fish. Yes, absolutely, feed it to your dog. The bones are fine. Everything is fine if they'll eat it, if they keep it down, if they
Yeah.
digest it well, and everything looks good. It's a fantastic food for dogs.
I feed salmon, and I know it's fatty, so and they keep it down and do okay. So salmon's okay.
Yeah, I think so, as long
Yeah.
as it's wild caught. I wouldn't feed farm raised
Yeah.
fish to any dog.
Right.
I've heard really horrible things about how fish are
Mm-hmm.
raised in those places. So
Yeah.
wild caught is expensive, but it's the
Mm-hmm.
best.
Okay. Well, we have a few more minutes, I think. I don't know. Do you have time for a few more questions?
Sure, if you have
Okay.
them. You
Yeah.
have questions?
I do.
Okay.
Some common questions that people ask about. One is poop eating and grass eating. What is that about, and should I be worried?
Poop eating is a huge issue because it's not only a huge issue in the minds of dog owners, it's a huge issue. It's a huge question for me to answer because it um it happens for so many different reasons. And it used to be, people used to just say, well, your dog is bored. And I suppose I suppose that does happen if a dog is, put in the backyard all day and they end up eating their own poop. There could be, an element of boredom there. But it could also be, and it's not just eating their own poop. If they eat the poop of another dog, they're eating partially digested dog food. So you don't want that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
You don't even want the dog eating dog food before it's digested, never mind when it's half digested. So you want to prevent that from happening. And sometimes dogs can, when dogs are first started on this plan, they're cleansing. And those, if anybody who's ever changed their diet radically knows how that feels. And we have lots of euphemisms for it. We call it cravings, we call it a detox, but it's withdrawal.
Mm-hmm.
It's withdrawal from a highly addictive substance. And in our case, the highly addictive substances are junky foods. In
Yeah.
their case, it's commercial dog food. So when you're going through that, we know, we can feel pretty, like we need something in our stomach. When you fast, you feel that way. You just need
Yeah.
to eat. And dogs can sort of feel that way too. And that leads them, we know that we're not supposed to eat certain things. They don't know.
Yeah.
And when they're not digesting their food very well and it comes out and it's partially intact, they might try to eat it again. And there's nothing wrong with that. I would prevent it if I
Mm-hmm.
saw it happening, but it's not a devastating thing for them to do it. If you discover that a dog has done that,
Yeah.
I'd be much more worried about a dog eating some strange dog's poop or eating cat poop or whatever that they find out there in the world,
Mm-hmm.
than I would if, say, you have two dogs and one dog eats poop and the other one doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I mean, and when it comes to wild poops like deer poops and rabbit poops, I let my dog eat that. Even horse poop.
Yeah.
um Interestingly, the dogs that I've seen eat horse poop will eat grass-fed horse poop,
Mm-hmm.
but not straw or hay-fed
Yeah.
grass
That's
or
interesting.
hay-fed horses
Mm-hmm.
um poop. So yeah, it's a huge range, and it can be something you want to prevent. It's probably almost always something you want to prevent. It's not the best thing, but it's not
Right.
it's not horrible either. They just don't have the aversions that we do. And so let's face it, some of our aversions are irrational.
So, what about the grass eating?
Yeah, nobody really knows why dogs eat grass, but lots of dogs do eat grass. Even properly fed dogs eat grass. It's one of those things that you can see it in a dog that has, known pathology, and you can also see it in a dog that's healthy. Like you
Mhm.
see, apparently researchers have seen wolves eating grass. Um, and they don't necessarily vomit when they do that. They don't
Mhm.
necessarily have worms. I mean, there's all kinds of myths that have arisen about that. Like, oh, the dog is not feeling well. He's trying to make himself vomit or whatever. I don't think you can come to any of those conclusions. I just don't think we know why dogs do it. They don't always
Right.
vomit. It sometimes comes through intact, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
I don't think they can digest it because they don't have the equipment. It just doesn't break down.
Yeah. Okay.
But
So, one of the other questions that we have is on environmental toxins. Can you explain why maybe this is something that we don't have to focus so hard on? Like, I think people think, oh, I got to worry about this and this and this in the house. Why does proper feeding protect our dogs from toxins like that? Do we need to be extremely concerned um, about toxins in our environment when it comes to our dogs?
I don't think we need to be extremely concerned, but
Mhm.
when I hear people, I've sort of gotten in the habit of picking up these red flags when people tell me about what they're feeding their dogs. And if one of the first things out of their mouth is I've gotten rid of all of my toxic household cleaners,
Yeah.
I know that that's a low priority thing. There's nothing good about those things. They
No.
don't You can find a natural alternative for all of those things that works just fine, but they are not causing your dog to itch. They're not causing stuff
Yeah.
to come out your dog's skin. Um, yeah, you can get rid of them, but and you should get rid of them.
Yes.
But the more important thing is that the dog is properly fed. And one of the reasons I say that is because there's been some very interesting research done about that by a doctor named Colin Campbell, who feeds, unfortunately for the little rats in his laboratory, he feeds some of them properly, like rats
Mhm.
are supposed to eat, and he feeds other rats improperly. He feeds them junk, the human equivalent, or the equivalent of human junk,
Mhm.
McDonald's and whatnot, and exposes them the same amount and level of exposure to a known carcinogen. And what he finds out in 100% of cases is that the rats that are properly fed do not get cancer.
That's
I mean,
amazing.
this needs to be shouted from the rooftops,
Mhm.
because that means that even smokers can do better. Even,
Yeah.
people that are working in these industries where they're in contact with known carcinogens can avoid disease potentially, if we extrapolate his findings,
Mhm.
and avoid cancer. So, I
Yeah.
mean, it's just hugely empowering to know that. Um,
That's
and it,
amazing.
yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
He talks about this in his book called Whole, WHOLE.
Okay.
And there's probably lots of other papers and books that he's written too where he talks about, but that's the one that I
Yeah.
heard about it, and it was very impressed with that.
There's some also some other new research that is coming out of the Voyager Wolf Project in Minnesota with the University of Minnesota, and they've done many peer review articles on the ecology of wolves. And one of the fascinating things, I think it's really cool that this research is now coming out that validates your 20 plus years of observation
Right.
in dogs and their health. But one of the coolest things that I thought was that out of 2+ months of the year, 80% of these wolves' diet is a single fruit, blueberries.
Blueberries. I know. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
And I mean, the fact of the matter is, wolves have been known to go 2 months without eating anything at all, even longer
Mhm.
than that.
Yeah.
They track wolves, and they know precisely what they eat. And now they have cameras set up everywhere, and they see what they do and everything. They see all their behaviors and their injuries and how they recover from their injuries and whatnot. Um, but yeah, it is really fascinating. And the rest of the time, these wolves are eating very lean, very um, they're not eating every day. They're not eating by the clock, you
Right.
know.
Yeah, I think
So
that's the one that also had observed the the feeding every 3 to 7 days
Right.
on average.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Right. So I think that's all I have. Did you want to cover anything else? How do people get in touch with you if they want to talk to you about this further, or if they want to do a consultation? Because I know you do consultations for people.
Right. The best way is to use the contact form through the website,
Mm-hmm.
nomorevetbills.com.
Mm-hmm.
And the book is on there, and I recommend that people read the book. And if they feel like they need some hand holding to order a consult, the book is really, it's meant to be a quick start guide, and it covers almost everything that anybody could think of to ask about, and anything that it doesn't cover, people get answers to on the Facebook group if they're on Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
So
And
it's
that group
mostly
is Healing Diets for
healing diet
Dogs
for
and
dogs and cats.
Cats.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for those who missed the first interview that we did, they can check out your YouTube channel. And for this video, comment below if there is another topic that you'd like Nora to discuss, and I'll get her back for another interview. But thank you so much for doing this again, Nora.
Thanks for your participation too, Kelly. I couldn't do it
Mm-hmm.
without you. So yes, I just want to second that. I would really love to hear people's questions in the comments. That would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I guess we'll wrap it up for the day then. Thanks so much
Okay.
for sharing your knowledge. It's amazing to hear the things that you've learned over the years.
Thanks, Kelly.
Yeah.